Diminutive Margaret Mitchell, the author, who rarely appears in public, attends to see her brainchild.
At the premiere, Mitchell shrank from the limelight, but after seeing the movie, she said a few words to the theater audience.
This picture was a great emotional experience for me, and I want to commend Mr. Selznick's courage and his determination to get the exact cast he wanted. I think you'll all agree with me. He had the absolutely perfect cast.
The movie's black actors had not come to Atlanta. In the era of segregation, they would not be able to stay in the same hotel as Clark Gable and Vivien Leigh. The following year, Hattie McDaniel would become the first African American to win an Academy Award for her portrayal of Mammy in Gone with the Wind.
I mean, we cannot believe that Hattie McDaniel was the first black to win an Oscar and could not come to Atlanta to the premiere. It's just, but at the same time, even in Hollywood, when she went to the Oscars, she was at a table by herself. She couldn't be with the rest of the cast.
In the early morning hours after the premiere, Mitchell wrote to Hattie McDaniel.
The premiere audience loved you, and so did I. The mayor of Atlanta called for a hand for our Hattie McDaniel, and I wish you could have heard the cheers.
As World War II raged in Europe, the Nazis banned Gone with the Wind. They claimed it inspired the French resistance.
I think the Nazis who banned Gone with the Wind were afraid that it would give people hope. It would give people the will to survive under occupation.
The Russians would later ban Gone with the Wind throughout the Soviet Empire. Scarlett O'Hara was not a fan of war, and that made her dangerous.
The cause didn't seem sacred to her. The war didn't seem to be a holy affair, but a nuisance that killed men senselessly.
During the war, she sent countless numbers of boxes, packages, to victims in the war-torn countries. Bessie often helped her.
Mitchell embraced the role of Red Cross volunteer and raised millions for the war effort.
She, of course, was asked to christen the USS Atlanta. She raised millions of dollars for that and went to New Jersey to christen that ship.
The very same Margaret Mitchell whose novel, Gone with the Wind, made literary and motion picture history. What more appropriate than to have Atlanta's favorite daughter christen the Atlanta?
When it was sunk during the war, she raised money and she christened a second USS Atlanta.
By the 1940s, Margaret Mitchell was not just famous, she was rich.
Nothing about her changed in any significant way with the income from Gone with the Wind, none at all.
Friends wonder why in hell I persist in driving a 1929 model car and wearing 4-year-old cotton dresses.
Instead of spending it on herself, she used it wisely to help other people.
In 1942, Mitchell received a letter from Dr. Benjamin Mays, president of all-black Morehouse College in Atlanta.
He said, will you give one scholarship of $80 for one student? And Margaret Mitchell wrote back and sent a check. So that was the beginning of the relationship.
It was enough to support a student for a year's worth of tuition. That's an attractive scholarship.
Benjamin Mays was a powerful figure who would become the mentor of Martin Luther King Jr. He sensed that Margaret Mitchell might be open to his ideas on education. He was right.
Dear President Mays, thank you for your ideas on the best use of the $2,000 I sent you for medical and dental students.
Mitchell and Mays began a secret correspondence. He would make the request, and she would send the money to educate African American doctors.
Racial tensions were very difficult and deep at that time. It's amazing that Dr. Mays and Margaret Mitchell were able to maintain that relationship in spite of it.
A Morehouse College student couriered the letters between Mitchell and Mays. because of the dangerous times, the two never met.
I liken it to an underground railroad in the sense of how they sent the letters back and forth.
If the world had discovered that Margaret Mitchell was supporting Morehouse College, that gesture could have threatened her life with those who might have been inclined to retaliate against anyone who was promoting black education.
For the rest of her life, Mitchell would send scholarship money to Dr. Benjamin Mays. None of the African American doctors knew who their benefactor was. Later, she quietly helped fund the first hospital for blacks in Atlanta.
The time will come when Atlanta will be the largest Negro city in the South. When that time comes, I hope we will have excellent Negro doctors to staff this hospital.
As time passed, she grew. She relinquished some early beliefs and convictions with which she had been reared and began to see the world through her own eyes.
She made such a great contribution to mankind. It was greater than money. It was something she did for humanity.
Mitchell's persona was shifting again. Now she identified herself as Mrs. John Marsh rather than Margaret Mitchell.
She could go places as Mrs. John Marsh where people wouldn't know Mrs. John Marsh, but they would certainly know Margaret Mitchell.
Margaret Mitchell's self-image, her persona, never settled into one form.
Am I a writer? Am I a wife? Should I be famous on my own? Should I make more money than my husband? What happens if I make more money than my husband? Is he Mr. Margaret Mitchell?
In spite of his wife's success, John Marsh still worked at Georgia Power. He also managed the business of Gone with the Wind, a formidable task. But in 1945, he suffered a massive heart attack and would never work again. For 2 agonizing years, Mitchell nursed her husband until he was out of danger. They lived quietly and were somewhat reclusive. Their favorite pastime was watching movies. But their love of movies would end tragically in Mitchell's final accident. On August 11, 1949, Margaret Mitchell was hit by a speeding car as she and John Marsh were crossing Peachtree Street. They were going to the movies. Mitchell was taken to Grady Hospital in Atlanta, where she lay in a coma for 5 days. Then, on August 16, 1949, Margaret Mitchell died. She was 48 years old. She was buried at Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta. A half-century later, the world would learn she had secretly educated dozens of African American doctors. But it was no secret to anyone that Margaret Mitchell had written a book for the ages.
A woman who had never written a novel comes out of nowhere, writes a book that becomes the biggest legend, most successful book published in the 20th century.
She wrote a text about what it means to be a human. And that is long, until we become machines and all clones, it'll continue to speak to the human condition and people will continue to read it.
Margaret Mitchell's last act of rebellion came from beyond the grave. She asked her husband to burn the original manuscript of Gone with the Wind upon her death. With great sadness, John Marsh watched as the flames consumed hundreds of pages. Before it was over, he rescued several chapters and stored them in a vault, in case anyone ever questioned her authorship. We may never know why Margaret Mitchell wanted to destroy the story she had spent a lifetime creating, but one thing seems certain: Gone with the Wind will live on and on.
If the novel has a theme, it is that of survival. What qualities are in those who survive that are lacking in those who go under? I only know that survivors used to call that quality gumption. So I wrote about people who had gumption and people who didn't.